Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes.
Today's a good one.
We are diving into
A deep one.
a fascinating and kind of infamous book.
Yeah.
Sigmund Freud's Three Essays on the Theory of Sexuality.
Ooh, yeah.
This book,
This one's a classic.
it really shook things up when it was published over a century ago.
Yeah, over a century ago.
And its impact on how we understand sexuality, especially in childhood, is just undeniable.
It's true. Freud's ideas were revolutionary, to say the least. I mean, he challenged so many assumptions about what's considered normal when it comes to sexual development. And even today, his theories still spark debate.
Oh yeah, for sure. It's definitely not your light beach read, but it tackles such fundamental questions about who we are and how we become the adults we are, sexually and emotionally.
Absolutely.
I mean, just the idea that our earliest experiences could have such a lasting impact on our desires and relationships. That's pretty powerful stuff.
Absolutely, and that's exactly what we'll be unpacking in this deep dive. So we're going to explore Freud's main arguments about the nature of sexuality, how it develops throughout childhood, and the various ways it can manifest in adulthood. We'll delve into concepts like infantile sexuality,
Okay.
the Oedipus complex psychosexual stages, and even his perspective on what he called perversions.
Okay, so for our listener who may not have tackled this dense read yet, can you give us a quick overview of the book's main themes? What are the big ideas that Freud is trying to convey here?
Well, one of the most important things to understand about Freud is that he saw sexuality as something present from infancy, not something that just suddenly emerges at puberty.
Okay.
He believed that the sexual instinct, though different in its expression from adult sexuality, is a driving force in our development from the very beginning.
So we're not talking about babies having sexual feelings in an adult sense.
No, not at all. It's more about how infants experience pleasure and satisfaction through different parts of their bodies, what Freud called erotogenic zones. For example, think about a baby's fascination with sucking, whether it's on a breast, a bottle, or even their own thumb. Freud saw this as an early manifestation of the sexual instinct, focused on the mouth as a source of pleasure.
Okay, so that's where this idea of psychosexual stages comes in, right? He's talking about how this infantile sexuality evolves over time.
Exactly. Freud outlines a series of stages: oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital, each associated with a different erotogenic zone and a different set of developmental challenges. He argues that how we navigate these stages, how our instincts are managed and channeled, shapes our adult personalities and our capacity for love and relationships.
And somewhere in there is the notorious Oedipus complex, right?
Yeah.
The one that everyone's heard of, even if they haven't read Freud.
Yes. The Oedipus complex is central to Freud's understanding of the phallic stage, which occurs roughly between the ages of 3 and 6. He suggests that during this stage, children develop unconscious sexual desires for their opposite-sex parent and feelings of rivalry towards their same-sex parent.
I can see why that one raised eyebrows.
Yeah.
But he wasn't suggesting that kids literally want to have romantic relationships with their parents, right?
Right. It's more about unconscious desires and fantasies that in healthy development are ultimately resolved. Through a process of identification with the same-sex parent, Freud saw this identification as a crucial step in the development of a mature sense of self and a capacity for healthy relationships.
Okay, that makes a bit more sense. So let's dive into the book itself, starting from the beginning. What does Freud say about the nature of sexuality in these essays? And how does he approach this topic that was so taboo at the time?
Well, right from the start, Freud challenges the conventional view that sexuality is simply a biological drive aimed at reproduction.
Okay.
He argues that sexuality is far more complex and multifaceted, encompassing a wide range of desires, pleasures, and aims.
So it's not just about procreation. It's about something more fundamental to the human experience.
Exactly. Freud saw sexuality as a powerful force that permeates our lives, influencing everything from our relationships to our creativity to our sense of self. He famously said the finding of an object is in fact a refinding of it, suggesting that our search for love and connection is rooted in our earliest experiences of pleasure and satisfaction.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there. So he's already challenging the norms and suggesting a much broader view of sexuality right from the start.
Absolutely, and one of the ways he does this is by drawing a clear distinction between what he calls sexual aim and sexual object.
Okay, break that down for me. What's the difference between those two?
Well, the sexual aim refers to the particular action or sensation that brings about sexual satisfaction. This could be anything from kissing to intercourse to various other forms of stimulation.
Makes sense. And the sexual object?
That refers to the person or thing towards which the sexual desire is directed. This is where things get really interesting, because Freud argues that the sexual object is not predetermined by biology.
So we're not just hardwired to be attracted to certain types of people.
Right. Freud believed that the sexual object is chosen through a complex interplay of innate dispositions, childhood experiences, and cultural influences. This is where his theory of object choice comes in, which we'll delve into later.
Okay. I'm already see how he's laying the groundwork for a much more nuanced understanding of sexuality than what was prevalent at the time. But let's stick with this idea of infantile sexuality for a moment. He dedicates a whole essay to this topic, which was incredibly controversial. What exactly is he arguing there?
Freud argues that children are not the asexual beings that society often assumes them to be. He suggests that they experience a range of bodily pleasures and sensations that, while different from adult sexuality, are nonetheless rooted in what he calls the sexual instinct.
So he's saying that babies and young children have a kind of proto-sexuality.
In a way, yes. He describes this infantile sexuality as being primarily autoerotic, meaning that it's focused on the child's own body and sensations, rather than on another person.
Okay, can you give us some examples of what this autoerotic behavior might look like?
Sure, think about thumb sucking, which we mentioned earlier. Freud saw this as a way for the infant to stimulate the erogenous zone of the mouth and experience a kind of primordial pleasure. He also pointed to the pleasure that children experience from touching their genitals, playing with their feces, or simply experiencing the sensations of their own bodies.
Okay, I can already hear the gasps from the audience back in 1905. This must have been shocking stuff to read at the time.
It absolutely was. Freud was challenging deeply ingrained social taboos by suggesting that children are not these innocent asexual beings. He was arguing that sexuality in its various forms is a fundamental part of the human experience from the very beginning.
And that's where the concept of erogenous zones comes in, right? These areas of the body that are particularly sensitive to pleasure and stimulation.
Exactly. Freud identified several erogenous zones, including the mouth, the anus, and the genitals. He believed that these zones become the focus of libidinal energy. During different stages of psychosexual development.
Okay, let's talk about those psychosexual stages in more detail. How does Freud see infantile sexuality evolving over time? And how does this development shape our adult personalities?
Freud outlines a sequence of stages: the oral stage, the anal stage, the phallic stage, the latency period, and finally the genital stage. He suggests that each stage is associated with a particular erogenous zone and a specific set of psychological challenges that the child must navigate.
Let's start with the oral stage. We've already touched on this a bit with the example of thumb sucking. What else is going on for a child during this stage?
The oral stage, which typically lasts from birth to about 18 months, is all about the mouth as a source of pleasure and exploration. The infant experiences the world primarily through their mouth, sucking, biting, tasting. And Freud believed that the way the infant's needs are met during this stage, whether they're overindulged or frustrated, can have a lasting impact on their personality.
So if a baby is weaned too early or too abruptly, could that lead to certain personality traits later in life?
Freud suggested that it could. He proposed that people who experience significant frustration during the oral stage might develop oral fixations later on, such as smoking, overeating, or even excessive talking. He saw these behaviors as a way of unconsciously seeking the gratification that was denied to them in infancy.
That's fascinating. It's like those early experiences leave a kind of imprint on our psyche. That can manifest in all sorts of ways. What about the anal stage? What challenges does the child face during this stage?
The anal stage typically occurs between 18 months and 3 years old, and it coincides with the child's potty training. This is when the focus of pleasure shifts to the anus, and the child becomes preoccupied with bowel movements and the control they have over their body.
Potty training, every parent's favorite topic.
Right. And Freud saw this as a crucial stage in the development of the ego, the part of the personality that deals with reality and self-control. He believed that how parents handle potty training, whether they're too strict or too lenient, can have a significant impact on the child's developing sense of autonomy and competence.
So are we talking about those classic anal retentive personalities?
That's one possibility, yes. Freud suggested that people who experience harsh or overly controlling potty training might become overly obsessed with orderliness, cleanliness, and control. On the other hand, those who experience very lax potty training might become messy, disorganized, or even defiant.
Okay, I'm starting to see how each stage builds upon the previous one, and how these early experiences can shape our personalities in such profound ways. Now, before we move on to the infamous phallic stage, I want to touch on something you mentioned earlier, one of Freud's most famous quotes. the finding of an object is in fact a refinding of it. What did he mean by that? And how does it connect to his theory of sexuality?
That quote gets to the heart of Freud's understanding of love and desire. He believed that our search for love and connection isn't simply a matter of finding someone who meets our needs in the present moment. It's also about unconsciously seeking to recreate those feelings of love and security that we first experienced in our early childhoods, especially with our primary caregivers.
So we're drawn to people who, in some way, remind us of those early love objects, even if we're not consciously aware of it.
Exactly. And this can be both a blessing and a curse. If those early relationships were healthy and loving, we might be drawn to partners who are kind, supportive, and emotionally available. But if those early relationships were difficult or traumatic, we might unconsciously seek out partners who recreate those patterns, even if they're ultimately harmful to us.
That's a powerful insight, and one that I think a lot of people can relate to, even if they never read Freud. It makes you wonder how much of our love life is actually dictated by our unconscious desires and past experiences.
That's a question that Freud grappled with throughout his work. He believes that we're not simply puppets of our unconscious, that we have the capacity for conscious choice and growth. But he also recognized that the unconscious exerts a powerful influence on our lives, especially when it comes to love and relationships.
Okay, I'm ready to tackle the phallic stage. This is the one that everyone's both curious about and a little afraid to ask about. What's going on during this stage? And how does the Oedipus complex fit into all of this?
The phallic stage, which typically occurs between the ages of 3 and 6, is when the child becomes aware of the differences between boys and girls, and their focus of pleasure shifts to the genitals. This is also when the Oedipus complex comes into play, which, as we mentioned earlier, involves a complex interplay of unconscious desires, anxieties, and identifications.
So walk us through the Oedipus complex. What's actually happening in the child's mind during this stage? And why did Freud see it as such a crucial turning point in development?
Well, to understand the Oedipus complex, we need to remember that the child at this stage is beginning to grasp the dynamics of relationships, particularly within their own family. They're observing the bond between their parents, and they're developing their own feelings of love and attachment, often directed towards the parent of the opposite sex.
So it's like they're starting to figure out the whole love triangle thing, even if it's all happening on an unconscious level.
Exactly, and that's where the conflict arises. Freud believed that the child unconsciously desires to possess the parent of the opposite sex and to eliminate the parent of the same sex who is seen as a rival for that love and attention.
Okay, I can see how that would create some tension in the family dynamic. But obviously most kids don't actually try to get rid of their same-sex parent. So how does this complex get resolved?
Well, Freud argued that the resolution of the Oedipus complex is a crucial step towards developing a healthy sense of self and a capacity for mature relationships. He believed that for boys, the resolution comes through what he called castration anxiety.
Castration anxiety, that sounds a bit intense for a little kid.
It is a rather dramatic term, but remember we're talking about unconscious fears and fantasies here. Freud believed that the boy, sensing his father's power and authority, develops a fear that his father might castrate him as punishment for his desires towards his mother.
So it's like a primal fear of retaliation for those forbidden desires.
Exactly, and this fear, according to Freud, is so powerful that it forces the boy to repress his sexual desires for his mother and to identify with his father. Instead, he starts to adopt his father's values, behaviors, and even his sense of masculinity.
So it's like a survival mechanism. The boy realizes that it's safer to align himself with his father than to compete with him.
That's a good way to put it, and through this identification with the father, the boy internalizes the father's moral code, which becomes the foundation of his own superego, the part of the psyche that governs our sense of right and wrong.
Okay, so that's how the Oedipus complex plays out for boys.
Yeah.
What about girls? How does it work for them?
Freud called the female version of the Oedipus complex the Electra complex, and he believed that it follows a somewhat different path. He suggested that girls realizing they lack a penis develop what he called penis envy. They blame their mother for their perceived inadequacy and unconsciously desire their father as a way of compensating for this lack.
Penis envy. That's one of those Freudian concepts that has been widely criticized as being a bit, well, sexist.
It's true that the concept of penis envy has been challenged and reinterpreted over the years, but Freud believed that it represented a deep-seated sense of lack or incompleteness that girls experience when they realize the anatomical differences between the sexes.
So it's not about literally wanting a penis. It's more about what the penis represents in terms of power or privilege.
That's a more modern interpretation,
Yeah.
yes. And Freud believed that girls eventually resolve this complex by transferring their desire from the penis to a desire for a baby. This leads them to identify with their mother and embrace a more traditionally feminine role.
Okay, so both boys and girls go through this process of desiring one parent, fearing the other, and ultimately identifying with the same-sex parent as a way of resolving those conflicts and developing a more mature sense of self.
That's the essence of Freud's theory, and he saw this whole Oedipal drama as a universal experience shaping our understanding of gender, love, and relationships.
It's certainly a dramatic way to frame childhood development, but I can see how those early family dynamics, even the unconscious ones, could have a lasting impact on how we relate to others later in life.
Absolutely. And Freud believed that if these complexes aren't successfully resolved, they can lead to a variety of psychological and relational difficulties in adulthood.
Makes sense. Now, I know Freud also talked about a period of latency after the phallic stage. What's happening during this time?
The latency period, which typically lasts from around age 6 until puberty, is a kind of time out from the intensity of the Oedipal conflicts. Sexual urges are relatively dormant during this time, as the child's energy is focused on school friendships and developing their skills and interests.
So a break from all the drama?
You could say that, but it's not that the sexual instinct disappears altogether. Freud believed that it's more that it's sublimated, channeled into other activities that are socially acceptable and personally fulfilling.
Sublimation. That word again, it seems like a pretty important concept in Freud's theory. Can you remind us what he meant by that?
Sublimation is the process by which we transform our primal urges, including our sexual desires, into something more socially acceptable or even creative. So, for example, instead of acting on forbidden impulses, we might channel that energy into our hobbies or our relationships in a way that's both personally satisfying and beneficial to society.
So it's like taking that raw libidinal energy and turning it into something beautiful or productive.
Exactly. Freud saw sublimation as a key mechanism by which civilization advances. It allows us to harness our primal instincts and channel them into something that benefits both ourselves and the world around us.
It makes you wonder if all those great works of art and literature are just sublimated sexual energy.
It's a provocative thought, isn't it? And one that Freud himself explored in his work on creativity and the artist.
Okay, we've journeyed through the oral, anal, phallic, and latency stages. Now let's talk about the final stage of psychosexual development, the genital stage. What does Freud say about this stage, and how does it relate to adult sexuality?
The genital stage, which begins at puberty, is marked by the reemergence of sexual urges with a new intensity. But unlike in earlier stages where the focus was on the self or on the parents, the libido now becomes directed towards others outside the family.
So this is where we start to see the development of mature adult sexuality.
Exactly. Freud believed that if we've successfully navigated the earlier stages of development, we'll be capable of forming healthy, loving relationships and experiencing sexual satisfaction within the context of a committed partnership.
But what if those earlier stages haven't been resolved so smoothly? What are the implications for adult sexuality?
That's where things can get complicated. Freud believed that if we've experienced significant trauma or conflict during those earlier stages, we might become fixated at that stage, which can lead to a variety of psychological and sexual difficulties in adulthood.
Can you give us some examples of what those fixations might look like?
Sure, someone who's fixated at the oral stage might have difficulty with intimacy trust or dependency. They might seek oral gratification through smoking, overeating, or even excessive talking. Someone fixated at the anal stage might struggle with control, orderliness, or a fear of messiness. And someone fixated at the phallic stage might have difficulties with sexual identity, authority, or competition.
So those early experiences can really cast a long shadow over our adult lives.
They can, but Freud also believed that these fixations are not necessarily permanent with insight and therapy. It's possible to work through these unresolved conflicts and move towards a more mature and integrated sense of self.
That's reassuring, it seems like Freud, for all his talk about the unconscious and these seemingly deterministic stages, ultimately believed in the possibility of growth and change.
He did. He saw psychoanalysis, the therapeutic approach he developed, as a way of helping people become aware of their unconscious patterns and to make more conscious choices about how they live their lives.
Okay, so we've covered the basics of Freud's theory of psychosexual development, but there's one more key concept that we need to explore, the libido. What exactly is the libido, and how does it fit into all of this?
The libido is essentially the psychic energy that fuels our desires, our drives, and our passions. It's the force behind our sexuality, but it's also the energy that propels us towards creativity work and all forms of pleasure and satisfaction.
So it's more than just a sex drive, it's like the energy source for our whole psychic lives.
That's a good way to put it. Freud believed that the libido is a finite resource, and how we choose to use it, how we direct it, and sublimate it shapes who we are and how we experience the world.
Okay, I'm
Yeah.
starting to see how this all ties together. The libido is the fuel,
Mhm.
the psychosexual stages are the roadmap, and our experiences along the way shape how that energy gets expressed.
Exactly. And Freud believed that understanding the libido and how it interacts with our conscious and unconscious minds is essential for understanding the complexities of human behavior.
Now, before we wrap up our discussion of psychosexual development, I want to touch on one more concept that Freud explores in these essays. The idea of perversions. It's a loaded term, and I'm curious to hear how Freud approached it. What did he mean by perversions, and how did he see them fitting into his overall theory of sexuality?
Well, it's important to remember that Freud was writing in a very different time when attitudes toward sexuality were much more rigid and restrictive. What he called perversions were simply deviations from what was considered the norm of heterosexual reproductive sexuality.
So he was talking about anything that fell outside of that very narrow definition of normal sex.
Exactly. And what's fascinating about Freud's approach is that he didn't view these so-called perversions as inherently pathological or immoral. He saw them as variations on the theme of human sexuality, often stemming from fixations or unresolved conflicts in those early psychosexual stages we discuss.
So instead of condemning them, he was trying to understand them.
Precisely, he believed that by studying these variations, we could gain a deeper understanding of the complexities of human desire and the many ways in which our sexual instincts can manifest.
Okay, so let's get specific. What are some examples of the behaviors that Freud explored in this third essay?
He covers a wide range, including fetishism, sadism, masochism, exhibitionism, voyeurism, and even things like bestiality. But again, the key is that he doesn't just list them and slap a label on them. He tries to unpack their psychological meaning, looking at how they might relate to individual experiences and developmental stages.
This must have been pretty radical stuff for readers back then.
Absolutely. Imagine reading about these taboo topics in 1905 when even discussing normal sexuality was considered scandalous. Freud was really pushing boundaries and challenging social norms with his work.
Let's dive into a specific example. How did Freud approach something like fetishism?
Fetishism for Freud was about the displacement of sexual desire onto an inanimate object, often something like a piece of clothing or a particular body part that wouldn't normally be considered sexual. He suggested that this displacement often occurs because the person has experienced some kind of anxiety or trauma related to more typical sexual situations.
So the fetish object becomes a kind of safe haven, a way to experience sexual pleasure without triggering those anxieties.
That's one way to think about it. And Freud also pointed out that the specific object of the fetish often has some symbolic meaning for the individual, representing some aspect of their unconscious desires or fears.
Okay, so it's not just random. There's a deeper psychological meaning behind the seemingly strange attraction to the object. What about sadism and masochism? Those seem particularly challenging to understand.
Freud saw both sadism and masochism as expressions of the aggressive instinct, which he believed was just as fundamental to human nature as the sexual instinct. He argued that in sadism, this aggression is directed outwards, while in masochism, it's turned inwards towards oneself.
So two sides of the same coin, in a way.
You could say that. And Freud also suggested that there's often a close connection between sadism and masochism, with individuals sometimes fluctuating between these two poles. He believed that this connection stems from the fact that both involve a kind of transgression of boundaries, a blurring of the lines between pleasure and pain, self and other.
I can see how that ties into his larger exploration of the drives and instincts that motivate us, even the ones that make us uncomfortable.
Exactly. And this brings us to another important concept that Freud introduces in this essay, the idea that neuroses, those psychological disorders that cause distress and dysfunction, can be seen as the negative of perversions.
What does he mean by that?
He's suggesting that neuroses might actually be a way of avoiding perversions. It's like the person has repressed those unconventional desires so deeply that they manifest as psychological symptoms instead of outward behaviors.
There's like two different ways of dealing with those impulses that society deems unacceptable.
Yeah.
You either repress them and develop a neurosis, or you act on them and get labeled a pervert.
That's a bit simplified, but it captures the essence of Freud's argument. He saw this connection as further evidence that there's no clear-cut dividing line between normal and abnormal when it comes to sexuality. It's all part of the same spectrum of human experience.
That's a pretty radical idea. Even today, it challenges us to think about these issues in a more nuanced and compassionate way.
It does, and it reminds us that judging people based on their sexual preferences or behaviors without understanding the complexities of their individual stories and experiences is not only unfair but also deeply unhelpful.
Well said. Now, before we wrap up our deep dive into 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, I want to touch on one more theme that runs throughout the book. The idea of bisexuality. What were Freud's thoughts on this, and how did he see it fitting into his overall theory?
It's true. This third essay is really where he kind of like goes all in on the complexities of human desire, and really challenges those conventional notions of like what is normal when it comes to sexuality.
Okay, so remind our listeners, what exactly did Freud mean by perversions? I mean, it's a word that's got a lot of baggage these days.
Right. And it's really important to understand it within the context of Freud's time. He was writing in the early 20th century. And back then, like, societal norms around sexuality were incredibly rigid. So anything that strayed from that very strict path of heterosexual reproductive sex, it was considered, deviant and was often pathologized.
So anything that didn't fit that narrow definition was labeled a perversion.
Basically, yeah. But what's so fascinating about Freud's approach is that he didn't look at these so-called perversions as just like, moral failings or signs of mental illness. He actually saw them as meaningful expressions of the individual's psychosexual development and often, stemming from like unresolved conflicts or fixations in those early stages we talked about.
So instead of judging or condemning these behaviors, he was trying to understand them psychologically.
Exactly. He was looking for those underlying motivations, the unconscious desires, the connections to childhood experiences, and he believed that by studying these variations in how sexuality was expressed, we could really gain a deeper understanding of the human psyche and just the complexities of desire.
Okay, so let's get specific. What are some examples of the behaviors that Freud explored in this essay?
He covers a lot, a wide range, including fetishism, sadism, masochism, exhibitionism, voyeurism, and even things like bestiality. But again, the key here is that he doesn't just like list them out and label them. He tries to really unpack their psychological meaning, looking at how they might relate to individual experiences in those developmental stages.
That must have been pretty radical stuff for readers back then.
Oh, absolutely. Can you imagine reading about these taboo topics back in 1905, when just talking about normal sexuality was considered scandalous? Freud was really pushing boundaries and those social norms with his work.
Let's dive into a specific example. How did Freud approach something like fetishism?
Well, for Freud, fetishism was really about this like displacement of sexual desire onto an inanimate object, often something like a piece of clothing or a particular body part that wouldn't normally be considered sexual. And he suggested that this displacement happens because the person has experienced some kind of anxiety or trauma related to, those more typical sexual situations.
So the fetish object becomes a kind of safe haven, a way to experience sexual pleasure without triggering those anxieties.
That's one way to think about it. Yeah. And Freud also pointed out that that specific object of the fetish, it often has some kind of symbolic meaning for that individual. It might represent some aspect of their unconscious desires or fears.
So it's not just random, but there's actually a deeper psychological meaning behind that attraction to that object. What about sadism and masochism? Those seem like particularly challenging concepts to understand.
Yeah, well, Freud saw both of those, sadism and masochism, as expressions of the aggressive instinct, which he believed was just as fundamental to human nature as the sexual instinct was, And he argued that in sadism, this aggression is directed outwards, at others, whereas in masochism, it's turned inwards toward oneself.
So two sides of the same coin in a way.
You could say that, yeah, and Freud also suggested that there's often a very close connection between sadism and masochism, with individuals sometimes fluctuating between those two poles, and he thought that this connection comes from the fact that both involve a kind of, transgression of boundaries, a blurring of the lines between pleasure and pain, self and other.
Okay, I see how that ties into this bigger exploration of the drives and instincts that motivate us, even the ones that make us uncomfortable.
Exactly, and this brings us to another important concept that Freud introduces in this essay. The idea that neuroses, those psychological disorders that cause distress and dysfunction, they can actually be seen as the negative of perversions.
What does he mean by that?
Well, he's suggesting that neuroses might be a way of avoiding perversions. Almost like the person has repressed those unconventional desires so deeply that they manifest as psychological symptoms instead of, outward behaviors.
So there's like two different ways of dealing with these impulses that society says are not okay.
Yeah.
You either repress them and develop neurosis, or you act on them and get labeled as a pervert.
That's a bit of a simplification, but you've captured the essence of Freud's argument. Yeah, he saw this connection as further evidence that there's not really a clear dividing line between normal and abnormal when we're talking about sexuality. It's all part of the same spectrum of human experience.
That's a pretty radical idea even now. It challenges us to think about these issues in a more nuanced and compassionate way.
It does, yeah. It reminds us that judging people based on their sexual preferences or behaviors without trying to understand, the complexities of their individual stories and experiences, it's not only unfair, but it's really unhelpful.
Well said. Now, before we wrap up our deep dive into 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, I want to touch on one more theme that runs throughout the book, the idea of bisexuality. What were Freud's thoughts on this, and how did he see it fitting into his overall theory?
So Freud believed that bisexuality is inherent in all humans. He saw it as a fundamental part of our nature, something present from birth, and that influences the development of both male and female sexuality.
So it's not something we choose or learn, it's just part of who we are.
That was Freud's view. Yeah, he argued that everyone has this potential for attraction to both sexes, even if that potential isn't always fully expressed or realized.
How did he see this bisexuality playing out in our psychosexual development?
Well, he believed that during those early stages, like the oral and anal stages, there's a fluidity to our sexual desires, a kind of, what he called polymorphous perversity, where we're not yet fixated on a specific gender or object of desire. But as we move through the stages, particularly that phallic stage with the Oedipus complex, our sexuality starts to become more defined, more channeled towards a specific object choice.
So it's like our inherent bisexuality gets shaped by our experiences and our relationships and all those social norms around us.
Exactly. And Freud thought that this process of channeling and directing our sexual energy is essential for healthy development. He saw it as a way to integrate those primal urges with the demands of society and, create a more stable and fulfilling life.
Okay, I think we've covered the major points of Freud's 3 essays on the theory of sexuality. It's been a fascinating and thought-provoking journey, even if some of his ideas feel a little bit outdated or controversial today.
It's true. Some of Freud's language and concepts might make us, raise an eyebrow in the 21st century, but it's important to remember that, he was a product of his time, and he was often challenging those very norms and assumptions that we now, take for granted.
Absolutely. And despite those controversies, there's no denying the impact his work has had on how we understand human psychology and the complexities of desire.
I think that's a great point to end on.
I agree. So for our listeners who are maybe grappling with these ideas for the first time, what would you say is the most important takeaway from Freud's 3 essays?
I think the most important takeaway is that sexuality is far more complex and multifaceted than we often give it credit for. It's not just about biology or reproduction. It's really about, that energy that animates our lives, our relationships, our creativity, our very sense of self.
Beautifully said. And it reminds us that to really understand our own sexuality and approach others with empathy and open-mindedness, we have to move beyond those, simplistic labels and judgments and really embrace the full spectrum of human experience.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive into Freud's 3 essays on the theory of sexuality. We hope you've enjoyed this journey into the depths of the human psyche.
And remember, folks, keep those minds open and keep those conversations going.
Thanks for tuning in to Books and Bytes. We'll be back next time with another fascinating deep dive into the world of ideas,